Dark clouds stretched across the sky, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The wind carried a whisper of something unseen, something ominous. In the distance, a siren wailed, but it wasn't the kind people used to hear in the old world. It was something else, a signal, a warning. The streets, once filled with the hum of everyday life, were now empty, cracked, and lifeless. The world had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about endurance, about faith, about holding on when everything else was slipping away. Caleb pulled his coat tighter around his body as he crouched behind an abandoned car. His breath came in short gasps, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He had been running for hours, but there was no safe place left. Not anymore. The cities had fallen first, then the towns. What remained were scattered pockets of people, some fighting to stay alive, others hunting for those who still believed. It wasn't just the world that had turned against them. It was the people, too. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow darting between the ruins of a collapsed building. Caleb's grip tightened around the rusted metal pipe he carried, his only weapon. He had seen too much, lost too much. He couldn't afford another mistake. He pressed his back against the cold surface of the car and closed his eyes for just a second, whispering a silent prayer. Was anyone even listening anymore? The answer didn't come in words, but in the steady sound of approaching footsteps. Caleb tensed. His body screamed at him to run, but he held his ground. Running hadn't gotten him anywhere. He had to face whatever came next. The shadow emerged into the dim light, revealing a familiar face, Eli. Eli looked just as ragged as Caleb felt, his clothes torn, his skin streaked with dirt. His eyes still held something rare in this world, hope. "You shouldn't be out here," Eli whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "They're close." Caleb swallowed hard. "I know." He hesitated before asking the question that had been burning in his mind. "Did you find it?" Eli nodded, pulling something from his pocket. A small weathered book, a Bible. Caleb's chest tightened. They had risked everything for this. It wasn't just a book. It was a lifeline. In a world where faith was outlawed, where believing made you a target, this book meant everything. "We have to go," Eli said urgently. "Now." But before they could move, a deafening crash echoed through the silence. A spotlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the ruins. Caleb and Eli froze. The hunt had begun. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. The spotlight swept across the rubble, its beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. Caleb and Eli flattened themselves against the cold ground, barely daring to breathe. The air smelled of dust and smoke, and every sound, every shift of rock, every distant creak of collapsing metal, felt like a betrayal. The world had become a place where silence was safety, and movement could mean the end. A voice echoed through the broken streets, mechanical and cold. "Surrender now, and you will be shown mercy." The words rang hollow. There was no mercy left. Caleb had seen what happened to those who surrendered. They disappeared, their names whispered in fear, their fates unknown. Eli gripped his arm, fingers pressing into his skin. "We have to move." His voice was barely above a breath. Caleb nodded. The spotlight shifted slightly, its beam crawling up the side of a crumbling wall. Now they scrambled forward, their bodies low, slipping through the wreckage like ghosts. The sound of their own footsteps felt too loud, but the wind was with them, howling through the ruins and covering their escape. They reached what was left of an alleyway, its walls cracked and leaning. Eli turned, eyes scanning the street behind them. "I think we lost them." Caleb wanted to believe that, but he knew better. Not for long. He looked at the Bible, still clutched in Eli's hands. "You're sure it's real?" Eli nodded. I found it in a hidden chamber under the church. It must have been there for years. He swallowed hard. This is the only one I've seen that wasn't burned. Caleb felt a weight settle in his chest. Faith was dangerous now. It wasn't just about what you believed, it was about what you represented. Those in control didn't fear weapons or riots. They feared hope. And that's what the Bible was, a light in a world that had been forced into darkness. A sharp noise made them both freeze. A crunch of gravel. Not far. Caleb grabbed Ailey's sleeve and pulled him deeper into the alley. They moved quickly, slipping through a shattered doorway and into what had once been a home. The walls were scorched, furniture overturned and broken. A child's toy lay abandoned in the corner, covered in dust. They pressed against the wall, hearts pounding. The sound of footsteps grew closer. Slow, careful, searching. Ailey's fingers tightened around the book. Caleb's grip on the metal pipe in his hand was slick with sweat. A shadow passed by the doorway. Caleb felt his breath catch. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Then a voice, low, cautious. Caleb. His blood turned to ice. That voice. It had been years since he had heard it. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes locking onto the figure just beyond the doorway. Hannah. She looked different. Thinner, her face sharper, her eyes tired. But it was her. There was no mistaking it. Eli exhaled in relief. You're alive. Hannah stepped closer, glancing behind her before pushing into the ruined house. Barely. Her voice was quiet, but her eyes burned with urgency. You have to come with me. Now. Caleb's mind raced. The last time he had seen Hannah was before everything had fallen apart. Before the world had turned against them. They had been separated in the chaos, and he had thought she was gone. Hannah glanced at the book in Eli's hands, and her expression hardened. They know. Eli stiffened. How? Hannah shook her head. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they're coming, and they won't stop until they find you. She hesitated, then looked straight at Caleb. You don't have much time. Caleb studied her face, searching for something, reassurance maybe. A sign that this was real. But there was only fear, raw and undeniable. We can't just run forever, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're not running. Hannah's gaze didn't waver. We're fighting back. Caleb exchanged a look with Eli. Fighting back. It sounded impossible. The world belonged to them now, the ones who hunted people like them, the ones who had rewritten the rules and crushed anything that stood in their way. But wasn't that what they had already been doing? Every time they ran, every time they hid, every time they held on to hope when they were told to let it go. Caleb took a slow breath and nodded. Where do we go? Hannah didn't hesitate. There's a place, a refuge, but we have to leave now. Eli looked out the shattered window. They're still out there. They always will be. Hannah's voice was steady, but we don't have to be afraid. Caleb felt something shift inside him. Fear had been his constant companion for so long, whispering in the back of his mind, keeping him moving but never letting him breathe. But now, staring at Hannah, at Eli, at the book in Eli's hands, something else stirred. Something stronger. Faith. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about believing. And that was worth fighting for. The night pressed in around them as they moved through the ruins, their footsteps careful on the broken ground. Every corner, every shadow felt like a threat. Caleb kept his grip tight on the rusted pipe in his hand, his senses sharp, scanning the darkness ahead. Hannah led the way, her pace quick but controlled, as if she had done this 100 times before. Eli clutched the Bible to his chest, as if letting go of it would take something from him. The weight of it wasn't in the pages. It was in what it represented. Hope, defiance. A truth that those in power had tried to erase. And because of that, it made them targets. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Hannah finally stopped. They stood in front of what had once been a church, its structure barely holding together. The roof had caved in, and the wooden doors hung from their hinges. But even in its brokenness, it still stood. "This is it," Caleb asked, his voice low. "For now," Hannah answered. "It's not safe for long, but we have time." She led them inside, stepping carefully over the debris. The moonlight streamed through the shattered ceiling, casting long shadows. Wooden pews were overturned, and dust coated the air. But Caleb could still feel something here, something unshaken. There were others inside. A handful of people, all huddled near the front of what remained of the altar. Their faces were marked with exhaustion, but their eyes lit up when they saw Hannah. "You found them," a woman whispered, relief breaking through her voice. "They found me," Hannah corrected. Eli and Caleb exchanged glances. They hadn't known there were more survivors here. A man stepped forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. "They're hunting," he said. "You must have led them straight to us." Caleb tensed. "We were careful." The man, older with deep lines on his face, studied them. Then his gaze dropped to the Bible in Eli's hands. His expression softened. "I'm Thomas," he said finally. "You don't have to prove yourself to me. But you do have to understand that being here means something." Caleb shifted. "What do you mean?" Thomas walked toward the center of the church and gestured around them. "They don't just fear us because we survive. They fear us because we still believe. Because we refuse to be silenced. That makes us dangerous to them." Hannah crossed her arms. "We have to do more than survive." Thomas met her gaze. "And you think you're ready for that?" "We don't have a choice," she said. The silence that followed was thick, filled with unspoken fears and unbreakable determination. Caleb could feel the weight of it pressing on all of them. Then a new voice spoke. "You're wrong about one thing." Caleb turned, surprised to see a younger man standing in the shadows. He looked barely older than Eli, his face sharp with defiance. "They don't just fear us because we believe," the man continued. "They fear us because, deep down, they know the truth. And no matter how much they try to destroy it, truth doesn't die." A murmur spread through the small group. Caleb could see it in their faces, the doubt, the hope, the fight still burning inside them. Hannah took a step forward. "Then let's make sure they never silence it." The air was thick with tension, but this time it wasn't the fear of being hunted. It was the weight of something bigger, something more than just surviving. Caleb clenched his fists, feeling the shift inside him. They weren't just running anymore. They were preparing for something far greater. A deep silence settled over the ruined church. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside, thick with unspoken fears and the cold grip of uncertainty. Caleb could feel his own heartbeat hammering in his chest, the tension almost suffocating. Outside, the wind howled through the broken streets, masking any distant footsteps that might be drawing closer. Hannah stood firm, her expression unreadable. "We don't have much time," she said. "They're looking for us, and they won't stop until they find us." Thomas folded his arms, his face grim. "Then we make sure they don't." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ailey's face. "How? We're outnumbered, outmatched." "If they find us here," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what happened to those who were caught. Hannah turned to Caleb, her eyes steady. "You know what we're up against." He nodded. He had seen it firsthand. The raids, the disappearances, the way people were stripped of their identities, their beliefs. until they became hollow shells of who they once were. The ones who fought back were never seen again. But something had changed. It wasn't just about running anymore. Caleb tightened his grip on the metal pipe in his hand, the cold steel grounding him. We don't wait for them to find us. Murmurs spread through the small group. Some looked afraid, others looked ready. Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're saying we fight." Hannah's voice was steady. "I'm saying we don't give them the chance to silence us." Eli looked down at the Bible in his hands. He was shaking, but not from fear. There was something else in his eyes now, something unbreakable. We have to protect this. The moment stretched long, filled with a quiet understanding. Then a sound shattered the stillness, distant at first. A low hum, mechanical. Caleb's stomach twisted. Drones. The church fell into motion, people scrambling, whispering hurried prayers under their breath. The hum grew louder, closer. Shadows danced along the broken walls as searchlights swept through the ruins outside. Hannah grabbed Caleb's arm. "We have to move. Now." Thomas was already pushing people toward the back of the church, where a collapsed section of wall opened into an alley. The exit was small, barely enough space to squeeze through, but it was their only way out. Caleb shoved a broken pew aside, making room as the first of the group started slipping through. Then the ground shook. A bright flood of light burst through the shattered windows. They had found them. The hum of the drones was deafening now, mixed with the shouts of approaching footsteps. Boots on pavement. Commands yelled in sharp, clipped voices. The front doors, barely hanging onto their hinges, groaned under a sudden force. Caleb turned to Eli. "Go." Eli hesitated for half a second, then ducked through the gap. More followed, one by one, disappearing into the alley. The doors cracked. A boot connected with the wood. Splinters flew. Hannah looked at Caleb. No words were needed. They turned and ran. The alley was tight, the broken walls pressing in on either side. Behind them, the sound of boots crashing into the church filled the air. Shouts, chaos. Then gunfire. Screams. Caleb didn't look back. He couldn't. He could only run. The city stretched before them in darkness, a maze of ruins and shadows. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Only the instinct to survive. Hannah led the way, weaving through the wreckage with a speed that came from experience. Caleb followed, his breath sharp in his lungs. Then ahead of them, figures emerged from the darkness. More of them, armed, waiting, a trap. Caleb skidded to a stop, his heart pounding. Hannah cursed under her breath. They were surrounded. The floodlights clicked on, blinding in the night. A voice rang out, calm and certain. "There's nowhere left to run." Caleb clenched his fists. But he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The lights burned into Caleb's eyes, forcing him to squint as the figures closed in. The steady hum of the drones above sent a shiver through his body. They were outnumbered, trapped on all sides, their escape route cut off. His grip tightened on the rusted pipe, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. His pulse pounded in his ears, and beside him, Hannah was still as stone. The voice came again, firm but calm. "Drop your weapons." No one moved. Caleb's mind raced, searching for an opening, an option, anything. He had spent too much time running, barely surviving. He wasn't ready to give up now. Then from the shadows, a sound. Soft at first. A single, sharp whistle. The figures around them tensed. In an instant, the ground beneath them exploded with movement. Smoke erupted from both sides of the alley, thick and blinding. A roar of sound followed, shouts, chaos, the unmistakable clash of bodies colliding. Caleb staggered back, coughing as figures emerged from the smoke, moving fast. But they weren't enemies. They were fighting back. One of the figures grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him through the confusion. "Move." The voice was urgent, familiar, but it wasn't until they cleared the smoke that Caleb saw who it was. Daniel, his brother. Caleb nearly stumbled, his mind struggling to catch up. He had thought Daniel was gone, taken like the others. But here he was, eyes sharp, face hardened by survival. "No time," Daniel snapped. "We need to go now." Hannah was already running beside them, her face unreadable. Behind them, the fight raged on, flashes of light cutting through the thick air. More of their people had been waiting in the shadows, hidden, ready. This wasn't just an escape. This was an ambush. Daniel led them through the maze of crumbling buildings, never slowing, never hesitating. Caleb's thoughts tumbled over themselves, his mind screaming with questions, but his body kept moving. Only when they reached an underground tunnel, hidden beneath a collapsed bridge, did they finally stop. Caleb spun, his breath ragged. How are you here?" Daniel's face was unreadable, because we've been planning this. Hannah narrowed her eyes. "Planning what?" Daniel exhaled, glancing at the others who had escaped with them. The tunnel walls pressed in, damp and cold. Somewhere behind them, distant gunfire still echoed through the streets. "We aren't the only ones left," Daniel said finally. "We thought we were scattered, alone. But we aren't." Caleb's heartbeat still hadn't slowed. "What are you saying?" Daniel met his gaze. "I'm saying we're not just surviving anymore." His voice was steady, certain. "We're taking back what they stole." A heavy silence followed. Hannah crossed her arms. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Daniel countered. "Look around you. They fear us because we still believe. But what happens if we stop hiding? If we stop running?" Eli swallowed, gripping the Bible tightly. "They have everything. Power, weapons." "They have fear," Daniel interrupted. "That's why they hunt us. That's why they silence us. Because they know if we stand together, they can't erase us." Caleb felt the weight of Daniel's words settle over him. He had spent so long thinking survival was the only option. But what if it wasn't? Outside, the war for their lives had already begun. And for the first time, Caleb wasn't sure they were losing. The tunnel was silent except for the distant echoes of gunfire still rattling through the ruins above. Caleb could feel his pulse in his throat, his body tense even in the stillness. The weight of Daniel's words lingered in the cold, damp air. This wasn't just about running anymore. It never had been. Daniel's eyes burned with conviction as he scanned the group. They think they own this city, that they control everything. But they don't control us. Hannah exhaled sharply. "If we do this, we can't turn back." "We never could," Daniel said. No one spoke. The choice had already been made. Caleb shifted his grip on the metal pipe, his hand steady now. The fear was still there, curling in the back of his mind, but it wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was something else, something sharper. Hannah looked at Daniel. "What's the plan?" Daniel knelt, brushing away dirt to reveal a faded map drawn onto the stone floor. "They've moved most of their forces to the outer districts. The city's core is exposed. The tower, where they broadcast their commands, their messages, it's right here." He tapped the center of the map. "If we take it, we take back our voices." Eli tightened his grip on the Bible. "And if we fail," Daniel met his gaze, "then at least we don't go quietly." The decision was made in the silence that followed. No more running. No more hiding. They moved fast, slipping through the tunnels that stretched beneath the ruins. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the city, where the towering steel fortress loomed above the broken streets. The air was thick with tension as they emerged into the night, weaving through the shadows, avoiding the drones scanning the alleyways. By the time they reached the base of the tower, the city was eerily quiet. It was never this quiet. Caleb exchanged a look with Hannah. "They know we're coming." "Let them," Daniel muttered. Then the silence shattered. Floodlights blazed to life. A sharp mechanical voice echoed from the tower speakers. "Surrender." Now, figures stepped from the darkness, guards in heavy armor, weapons raised. But something was wrong. They weren't moving to attack. They were waiting. Caleb's stomach twisted. This wasn't a fight. It was a trap. Daniel took a step forward, his fists clenched. "We're not afraid of you." The voice from the tower didn't respond. Instead, a single figure emerged from behind the guards. A tall man dressed in black, his face eerily calm. Hannah stiffened. "No." Caleb turned to her. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. The man stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over them before settling on Caleb. "You don't know, do you?" His voice was smooth, almost amused. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. "Know what?" The man's expression didn't change. "Why you were never caught. Why you always managed to escape." A slow dread crept through Caleb's veins. The man tilted his head. "Because we let you." The words hit like a blow. Caleb's mind reeled. No, that couldn't be true. Daniel stepped forward. "You're lying." The man didn't even look at him. "Am I?" His gaze stayed locked on Caleb. "You were never running. You were being led." The world around Caleb seemed to blur. Every close call. Every time they barely made it out. It had never been luck. It had never been skill. It had been controlled. The man took another step. The question is, why? Caleb's hands trembled. He had spent his whole life fighting against them. Running. Surviving. And now. Hannah grabbed his arm. "Don't listen to him." The man smiled slightly. "But he wants to." The guards lifted their weapons. Daniel moved first. A single gunshot cracked through the night. Chaos erupted. Caleb barely had time to think before he was moving, diving behind a rusted barricade as bullets tore through the air. The tower's alarms blared, drowning out the shouts and screams. Daniel was on the ground. Blood pooled beneath him. Caleb's breath caught. "No." Hannah pulled him back, her face pale. "We have to go." But Caleb couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Daniel was still alive. His lips moved, his voice barely above a whisper. "Finish it." The world spun. The tower loomed ahead. Caleb's heart pounded. His whole life had been leading to this moment. The truth didn't matter anymore. The lies didn't matter. Only one thing did. He wasn't running. Not anymore. The gunfire faded into the distance, but Caleb barely heard it. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he knelt beside Daniel, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Daniel's face was pale, his breath shallow. "Stay with me," Caleb pleaded, his voice shaking. Daniel's fingers tightened around Caleb's wrist, his grip weaker than before. "You know what to do." His eyes, though clouded with pain, were steady. "End it." Caleb swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to stay, to keep fighting for his brother's life. But the mission wasn't over. If he didn't move now, everything they had fought for, everything Daniel had believed in, would be lost. Hannah crouched beside him, her expression unreadable. "Caleb," she said quietly, "we have to go." Caleb's heart wrenched, but he knew she was right. Daniel managed the faintest of smiles. You were always meant for more. Then his hand slipped from Caleb's wrist, falling limply to the ground. Caleb's breath hitched. The world blurred around him. But there was no time to grieve. He forced himself to stand, ignoring the tightness in his chest. The tower still loomed ahead, untouched, its broadcast filling the air with commands meant to break them. If they didn't take it now, the fight would be lost. Hannah gave him a single nod, and together they ran. The guards had been thrown into chaos, their ranks scattering after Daniel's sacrifice. Caleb and Hannah wove through the wreckage, climbing over debris and slipping through the shadows until they reached the side of the tower. The entrance was unguarded. Too easy. Hannah hesitated. It's a trap. I know. Caleb tightened his grip on the rusted pipe still clutched in his hand. But we don't have a choice. They moved quickly, slipping inside the steel doors and into the heart of the enemy's control. The air was cold, sterile. The hum of machines filled the silence, and bright screens flickered along the walls, displaying surveillance feeds of the city, the people still hiding, still afraid. And in the center of the room, the man in black stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look surprised to see them. If anything, he seemed amused. You made it, he said smoothly. I was beginning to wonder if you had the courage. Caleb's jaw tightened. Turn it off. The man tilted his head. Turn what off? The broadcast. Hannah stepped forward, her voice cold. The lies. The orders. All of it. The man chuckled softly, as if they had said something foolish. You think shutting this place down will change anything? He gestured to the screens. People are afraid. And when people are afraid, they look for order. Structure. That's what we give them. You control them, Caleb shot back. We give them peace. The man's voice was calm, almost pitying. If we don't, the world falls apart. Caleb took a slow step forward. No, he said, his voice steady now. People don't need you to tell them who they are. They don't need your rules. They need the truth. The man sighed. Truth. He said the word like it was a child's fantasy. Truth is dangerous. No, Caleb said. Fear is dangerous. And then he moved. Faster than the man expected. Caleb swung the pipe, shattering one of the monitors. Sparks flew, the screen flickering before going dark. The man took a step back, expression unreadable, but Hannah was already moving too, slamming her fist against the control panel. The machines whirred in protest, alarms blaring through the tower. Stop. The man's voice rose, his calm finally breaking. Caleb didn't. He grabbed the nearest chair and drove it into the main console. The screens flickered wildly, the words of control and fear distorting into static. The broadcast wavered. And then it was gone. A deep silence filled the tower. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. Hannah exhaled, staring at the darkened screens. It's over. The man's face was unreadable, but something in his eyes had changed. Not anger. Not fear. Recognition. Like he had known, deep down, that this was inevitable. Caleb turned away from him, stepping toward the broken screens. The weight in his chest was still there, but it wasn't despair. It was something else, something lighter. Footsteps echoed from the hallways. The others had made it. Eli, Thomas, the ones who had survived the fight outside. They stood in the doorway, their eyes wide with disbelief. You did it, Eli whispered. Caleb looked out over the city through the tower's shattered window. For the first time in years, the streets weren't filled with the blaring voice of control. Only quiet. People were stepping from their hiding places, looking up at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. Hannah touched his shoulder. "It's not over," she said. "Not really." Caleb nodded. She was right. The fight wasn't over, but the fear was. And for the first time in a long time, there was hope.